Hello everyone, I'm Ellie Stutz, Knowledge Manager for PNMsoft, and welcome to our webinar, Preventing and Eliminating BPM Bottlenecks, Errors, and Bugs. Joining me today in presenting this webinar is our support team leader at PNMsoft, Shlomo Steinmetz, and we'll be taking your questions as we go along. So the format of this program is as follows. We're going to talk about bugs first, then error handling, then bottlenecks, then we're going to give some bottleneck examples, and finally we'll be taking your questions. Let's jump into it. Why are we here today? What are our goals? Errors and bottlenecks and bugs are the scourge of many projects. You can put numerous resources, spend a lot of money, build a wonderful BPM system with great processes, and if you don't deal with these three issues, then you can lose out because your process will not run as smoothly as it should. Your end users may complain of things that aren't working, and the project can be put at jeopardy. Now, there are tools that we provide here at PNMsoft with our BPMS product sequence, which can aid you in reducing, vastly reducing bugs, errors, and bottlenecks. And we're going to really be showing you how to use those tools today. Now, I must say, to start off, that despite all the tools that we're going to show you today, all bugs, errors, and bottlenecks ultimately have their source in human error. There's no real, there's no such thing really, truly, as a non-human error. Of course, it can be a human error which was gone from a human to a program and then became an error, but that's still ultimately a human error. So the first thing we're going to emphasize in this webinar is how to focus on the human element, how to build the human base of your BPM project strongly so as to minimize errors which are ultimately based in the human element from happening. So these are some things which you should keep in mind when you're building your BPM project. First of all, form your BPM project team with care. Choose experts, professionals, people with high skill levels. That almost goes without saying. Secondly, use BPM best practices when you're planning your BPM project and when you're managing your BPM project, because, and this webinar is not about those BPM best practices, but if they're not used, then all the error handling and bug elimination in the world is not going to help. Thirdly, give your BPM developers and analysts training in the system that they're going to be using. And we provide training here at PNMsoft, and we'll be more than happy to organize with you training sessions for your developers. Without the knowledge of how to use the BPM system, obviously bugs and errors and bottlenecks will be created. So that is obviously key. Finally, we highly encourage you to follow global standards for software development, including the MSF Microsoft Solution Framework, CMMI, Capability Maturity Model Integration. So these are real keystones and base elements of making sure that you have the human element correct before you go ahead and jump into a BPM project and as you go along. But let's get to bugs. Okay, so these are some tips that we're going to give here right now of how to prevent bugs from happening and then how to discover bugs once you have already begun to develop a solution. First of all, plan your development well. A poorly planned BPM solution is a recipe for bugs, a recipe for errors. So planning is first. Secondly, when you're designing your BPM workflows, organize your design in such a way so that your workflow does not look like one giant, big, unreadable mess, but rather compartmentalize and modularize your design so that your workflow is understandable. It's modular. If you have a giant workflow, consider using subflows as part of your solution so that you basically maximize understanding and you minimize chaos in your workflow. And we'll take a look in a moment about what I'm talking about. you can assign areas of your workflow to different teams or people. So we call these process quadrants. That will also help because you don't have, every part of the workflow is assigned to everyone. Each part has a specific owner. Each part has a specific responsibility, and therefore that will prevent errors because simply you've divided up the work. Fourthly, document the interfaces between those quadrants. Your teams should be not just document, but they should be communicating with each other. The process owners should be documenting how they're going to be transferring information from one part of the process to the next, and that will also prevent errors and bugs. Finally, develop in stages. Don't try to build the solution overnight from 0 to infinity, but rather build it in stages, build the basics first, and then add on once the basics are working. Now, that was as far as bug prevention. As far as discovery of bugs, and we'll take a look in a minute in sequence about how we actually have tools which help you to discover bugs. Use sequence validation tools, and we'll see this in a moment. And the sequence debugger, which is an amazing tool which helps you debug your process in a wonderful interface, and we'll take a look at that in a second. Also, obviously, once a BPM process has been designed, it needs to go through testing. That's QA testing, that's user acceptance testing, UAT testing, and stress testing for extreme conditions. Those two will help you discover bugs. And finally, we can't forget the end user. The end users must be involved, and certain bugs will only be found when the end users are actually testing the product itself in a real-life scenario. So that's the theory. Let's take a look right now. There's our bug going out. We're going to take a look right now in sequence. Second. Okay, here we are in sequence administration. And let's first take a look at the validation tool, which can be used to find errors and bugs before you actually take the process to the next steps of production. So here we have a process, and I'll tell you right off, it's been designed with bugs, and I'm not going to get into the whole thing. This is a hotel registration process, very simple model of it. And in the sequence workflow design interface, we have this very valuable tool, the validation tool, which will analyze the process and show us what the errors are before we actually go ahead and execute the process. So this brings up a list of common errors which sequence has found, which you need to take care of. Some of them are errors and some of them are warnings, which you need to take care of before you go ahead and implement this process in production. So obviously you should use the validation tool. And sequence has other validation tools throughout. For example, if you add a new expression to your workflow, then you're going to be using there's a very simple validation tool here which you need to run before you actually are able to implement the expression, and this is also something which you need to be using. And finally, there are validation tools throughout sequence. I'm not going to go through all of them, but we have also in the deployment module, when you're deploying, we talked about this last webinar, when we're deploying a sequence workflow between environments. So sequence also provides a validation button there, which brings up a list of errors before you deploy and enables you to troubleshoot your deployment before you actually go ahead and deploy workflows between environments. So we have several validation tools that are inherently part of sequence, and all of them are advisable to be used. And for more details on validation tools, you can consult our support team and also go to our knowledge center at members.pnmsoft.com. And I'll just give a shout out right now and say that we have a new, brand new and improved knowledge center, and I highly advise you to go and take a look at it. Okay, so that was validation. Let's take a look at the sequence debugger. Okay, so we have a process here which is a recruitment process where a company is accepting a new employee, and there's an initial meeting, and then the new employee requires an office, and then there's a check with the database if the office is available, and then there's an update to the company portal on the details of the new employee and his office. That's the basic process. Before we execute this process in sequence runtime, we're going to use a very valuable tool, which is the sequence debugger. So we're going to click here right now and start a new instance. You can also connect to a existing instance or the previous instance using the sequence debugger. We're going to start a new instance. And as I'm doing this, I'll mention that this is, in effect, running an instance of the process, a real instance of the process. So it's not, you're actually running it. It's actually taking effect in the database. It's something to keep in mind. So here we are in the debugging interface. And there's two windows here. We have the workflow tab, which shows you our workflow and enables you to follow through it in the debugger. And we also have an output tab, which we'll get to in a second. On the left-hand side, we have workflow properties. And on the right-hand side, we also have, we have workflow properties and also a process tree. And on the right-hand side, we have the properties of each of the activities. So you double-click the initial form, the first meeting, and that takes us to the output window. And then we fill this in. And we'll do this very quickly. And then we hit update. We get to, let's take a look at the workflow tab once more. So we get to already the task of the process, the office request. And you can see that in the tree here. So you're really following the process as it goes along. Here we have the activity instance properties. So let's complete the second form. Let's approve the office. And update. And then we'll see how this moves along in the workflow tab. Now, what I will do, I'll do this a second time, is we can actually insert a breakpoint and stop at different stages throughout the debugging. But I'll already mention that the debugging enables you to see various details regarding certain activities, especially stored procedures, and this is a stored procedure. So here you can actually click the stored procedure and test it and preview what's going to happen when you run it. And you see here we have two errors. We have to deal with those errors, and that's something that the debugger shows you before you go and implement the workflow. Secondly, here we have a web service consumer, and the web service consumer in the debugging interface, we are actually able to view the XML of this web service consumer. I'm clicking here in advanced, and here we actually see the XML of the web service consumer. So the debugger really shows you a lot about the activities that you're going to have in your workflow. Also, when you run the workflow in sequence runtime, you only see the human activities. You don't see the stored procedure. You don't see the web service consumer. So the debugger really enables you to go step by step through the workflow. Now let's start this one more time. And here I'm going to add a breakpoint. I'll show you how to do that. So now I want to stop the debugging right here. I click on this connector, right-click, and hit Add Breakpoint. Now I've added a breakpoint, and when I now go through the debugging, it will stop at this point until I'm not going to fill out all the form details. Here we go. Oh, I'm going to start it one more time. That was my condition. 1 second. Condition states that if I choose for the employee to have a new office, then it goes through the rest of the activities, but otherwise it goes straight to the end. So I actually do have to fill that out. 1 second. Requires office. Okay, now let's take a look at where we are. Have we reached the breakpoint yet? Okay, not quite yet. Let's reach the breakpoint. Okay, now here we're stalled at the breakpoint. As you can see, the breakpoint has changed color from red to yellow. If I want to continue, so I'm going to have to do continue. Continue process, and that will take it past the breakpoint. You can also remove breakpoints by right-clicking. Since we finished, you can remove breakpoints by right-clicking and simply clicking Remove Breakpoint. Okay, we'll demonstrate that later. Okay, let's see where we are. So we've gone through the validation, gone through the debugging. Okay, and what I mentioned before about organized workflows, in the sequence designer interface, you want to split workflows into areas and divide up those areas between your BPM process development team. I'm not going to go into much detail exactly here yet, but that's the basic idea. If you have a very large workflow, please consider splitting it into quadrants and assigning quadrants to specific teams. Let's talk about error handling. Now, errors can occur anywhere in the process, and Sequence provides 3 very effective tools for handling errors. And they are compensation, the error handling activity, and the new or upcoming error handling wizard. We're going to take a look at all 3 right now. Let's see how they work. Okay, so before we go into how the error handling works, let's take a quick break for questions. Shlomo?
Thank you, Ali. Two quick questions.
Debugger, you mentioned using it before while developing. There's very practical use also after the fact. We call the debugging after the fact. If your workflow didn't behave quite as you thought, it went down the path that you didn't expect, or it didn't quite perform up to speed and things like that, the debugger is also very useful for forensic work, to follow it through, not just looking at the human activities jumping between the human activities, but it's a visual representation of where your workflow went and how many times around it went. Each time you touch on and you mark a specific activity, it shows you all the metadata about itself, when it was created, who created it, which activity preceded it, which activity it itself continued onwards. It's very useful for after-the-fact debugging, especially when you have workflows that aren't going where you expect them to. The second item, and a quick thing, the process quadrants and areas. There's a whole, I got a few questions on that. There's a whole college of learning about UML and process design and modeling and everything else. We're not going to go into that. The scope of what Ellie was saying before is about how to keep your process bug-free and error-free. The first thing is to keep it in order. And we're not going into the theories of UML, but if you have a process, using the example from before of a new employee that needs a new office, so there you would divide it up into the different bits. The interviewer would be one bit of the process, and there could be a whole bit of logic inside that. Once the interviewer says the interface of that is either yes or no, you got the job or you didn't get the job. Your second quadrant, the second area, would be the logistics of it, the office, the computer, the car, whatever. And then you would have a third process, for instance, the money side of it that would go to HR and to accounting. And each of those has a very relatively thin interface between them. In other words, the interviewer says yes or no. The logistics says I'm ready, I'm not ready, or when I'm ready. The HR will say, okay, we have enlisted. And each clump like that could be visually represented in a separate part. It could be a lane, it could be whatever, separated by a little bit of space. The idea is you'll know who's talking to who and through which interfaces. If anybody else has any other questions, then please feel free to send them through the chat, and we'll address them a bit later.
Thank you very much, Shlomo. So let's take a look at the 3 tools which Sequence provides in order to enable error handling. The first one is compensation. Compensation means that when we have a workflow process, you can, when we have a workflow, you can define for any, not for any activity, for many of the integration activities, what happens if the activity fails and cannot continue. You can define a second activity in the same workflow from which to continue the workflow upon the failure of this activity. So for example, here in this workflow, which models a document review process, we have the initial form to request a document. The second activity is a web service consumer which goes ahead and gets the document from or communicates with a web service and gets the document over the web. Now what happens if this activity somehow fails? Let's say the connection is down. Let's say there's something wrong on the other end. We want to define where the process will go upon failure of this Docker Retrieve Web Service Consumer activity. So here in the properties, we have the compensation field. So here I can select any of the other activities in the process from which to continue upon the failure of this activity. So that brings me to the second error handling tool, which is the error handling activity. So I've actually chosen this activity, the handle web error activity over here, and that's one of the serve activities. It's the the error handling activity. I've already added it to the workflow, and this actually generates an error object, which includes the message and other error details. So first I've sent the workflow to here. That will generate this activity, which gets the error details from the failed activity, and then I've connected it to a manual document loading activity, which will help you get the document manually, and then send it in for approval. So before we actually run it, I'll show you as well how we use the error object that was collected in the error handling activity. We're going to use it in this activity, the manual document load activity. We're going to use it to actually display the web error message that we got from that failed web service consumer as the default value of this text area. Here in default value, we've selected handle web error. That's the error handling activity. We've selected the message attribute here, which is actually the error message that comes back from that failed web service consumer. Here's a little validation that we talked about earlier, that it's expression tested successfully, and there we go. And now let's run this process and we'll see how it actually works. We'll use our debugger. Okay, I'm not going to go through all the fields here, but let's just do it quickly. Requires a view. Update. Okay, and it took us now to the manual document load. Why? Because the web activity failed, and we get the error message right here, as I showed you from the default value, unable to connect to the remote server, and now the process participant or the stakeholder knows why that activity failed, and we leverage that information straight into the process. Okay, and then it goes straight to the end of the process. So we've seen those two tools, and now we'll take a look at the third tool, which is actually an upcoming feature in Sequence called the AirHandling Wizard. And this gives you additional control over handling errors. One second, I'll have to log in again. I'm actually going to do like this. Okay, so here we have a lot more control over activities or workflows that have errored. Right-clicking, as you can see in the administration table, right-clicking error handling and then clicking view will bring up a window which is for local administrators, enabling them to see which processes have errors and then deal with them. So we have three types of processes that can have errors. First is stalled processes. These are processes which have a failed activity, basically an activity whose result is failed and has no other instance activity that has this activity as its source. Okay, we see we have one like that. We have abandoned processes, and we'll get to that in a second. Actually, we'll get to that right now. These are processes which have not been updated in the last 6 months. So that already brings a suspicion that there may be something wrong with those processes. They've been basically left hanging. And we actually do have a couple like that. I'll just get to them. So we have three like that. There are fields here which enable you to filter the list that you see in the AirHandling Wizard, you can enter the instance ID, and you can choose the workflow space that you'd like to look at. And finally, we have compensated processes. These are processes which have a compensated activity, as we saw earlier. Let's see if we have any of those. In any case, you can look for either of these kinds of processes, stalled, abandoned, or compensated. Now, what happens when you find, let's hit reset here. What happens if you find one of these processes? You find a stalled process, and now you can decide whether to delete the process or abort it, or force resume it. And that gives you power over, gives you a lot more control over what to do with processes that have encountered problems. So this was a quick sneak peek into an upcoming feature in Sequence, the AirHandling Wizard. Let's move on. We talked about air handling. Now let's talk about bottlenecks. Now bottlenecks are basically the poor performers in your process. You've got a process with several activities with multiple stakeholders and end users and participants, and part of the process is always going to be the slowest part, and sometimes a very slow part, which is basically creating a bottleneck and harming the performance of your BPM solution. So what are the sources, what are the general sources of bottlenecks in a BPM solution? The first could be a human performance issue. It could even be an individual human performance issue, as in one stakeholder is not performing his tasks on time or has difficulty with his tasks. And that's something you've got to isolate and find out in order to solve. It could be more than one person. It could be a group, or it could be the entire organization has a performance problem, has some kind of difficulty, which also needs to be found. It might not be with the entire process, but it might be with part of it, and that's something which you need to find. And in a minute, Shlomo's going to actually show us some examples of these cases. It could be a technical problem. It could be some of the bugs or errors that we talked about earlier. It could be a system problem. It could be an incompatibility problem, a performance issue. These can also create bottlenecks in your process. It could be the result of a process which hasn't been designed properly. Maybe you need advice from our professional services team in order to help you better design your processes. And finally, it could be an issue of designing a process which is synchronous when it should be asynchronous, as in you have part of the process which takes longer, and it's been set up in a way which is set up in series, and the entire process is waiting for that activity to complete, whereas if you set up the workflow in parallel, you could be achieving a lot more at the same time as that process takes to complete. So that's some of the theory behind the major bottleneck sources. And now I'm going to give the microphone over to Shlomo to give some actual practical examples of how to isolate and eliminate bottlenecks using Sequence.
Hi everyone. We'll get on to a bit more technical bit now. To quickly cover a few extra points that Ellie mentioned earlier, when you're talking about the poorly designed processes, sometimes it's not clear cut. It's part of the stuff that you learn in the cycle of BPM. You deploy a version of your workflow thinking that a certain person or a certain group will be expected to get a certain workload, and you'll find that, well, it takes longer than you expected, and that's what you want to learn over here. Sometimes it's about shifting people from one group to another to even out the workflow so that it runs statistically smoother. In other cases, it's more extreme. The most extreme one that I've ever seen, actually, that I've taken care of, was a workflow involving over 4,000 people. 4,000 people's work. Eventually, because of a human error, the last activity, the last task in the workflow, they all funneled into a single person's inbox and kept there. Essentially, the person was collecting an impossible amount of work every day, And they couldn't figure out why the workflows weren't getting completed on time. And it didn't take very long to figure out that one person can't really process something on the order of 1,600 workflows every day, so there was a certain backlog to that. We'll look at a few KPIs, key performance indicators right now, to give us an idea of how you can find this for your existing workflows, for new workflows that you're designing, how you can prepare it. And we'll have 3 examples. The script that we'll be briefly covering now, we're not going to dive very deep into the script, will be published together with the webinar's content. And we'll be happy, of course, to provide one-on-one help to our customers to customize it and to implement it. Let's move on over to our machine over here, to the live thing. We have 3 examples, like I said, and this one, for lack of a better terminology, I called it the on-time histogram. The idea being, we take a range of our tasks in each age group being from the tasks that are most quickly completed, which are, as you can see over here, minus 24 hours, meaning they're 24 hours early. They're completed 24 hours before their deadline time, to the ones that are taking the longest amount of time, 1,336 hours, and we divide it up into a certain range. Mathematically, look at the range, divide it up into a certain amount of bars, and you get an idea that most of the workflows over here, as you can see, are gravely late. And of course, this isn't a real environment, because if it were, I'd be fired. This is my sandbox, and what you can see over here, the first idea, this is the first glimpse that you want to look at, is this represents a bad situation on our environment. Now, how do we check it out? Each of these eventually comes from an SQL stored procedure. We look at it over here. It's the get on time histogram stored procedure. The idea is, and we'll be happy again, we have a separate webinar on the sequence database structure that can give you an idea of how to prepare these queries wisely, and we'll be happy to assist online to anybody that would like to modify these. The idea over here is we're building around the action items table. Whenever you have a task, ultimately it's written into the action items, and there are references to various other tables, the workflow instance table, the activity instance table. And what we're collecting over here is the date difference in hours between when it's due and when it was actually completed. That's the whole thing. There's a whole variety of differences we can filter over here. You can filter it for a particular workflow GUID for workflow template ID, so that you're not looking at the entire collection of work, but for a specific workflow, and hence the duplication over here. And the second part is especially written in not the most efficient, but in the way that will allow you to see the logic behind it. You declare the minimum, the maximum, divide it up into 20. It's all simple math that's happening in SQL, and you fill up a table with each workflow instance that fits in, and the ultimate result, the end result, as we saw, is this. The great majority of them are very old tasks that need to be addressed. Moving on to the second example, the employee pressure. Over here, I did it by specific people. Again, this is a small sandbox environment used by only a handful of people, and what we want to measure over here is the number of pending tasks for each of the employees in the environment. Of course, if you're talking about any even small to medium business, you can't really work for it's not practical to look by particular employees. So you can easily modify this to work by groups or even by entire branches of the organizational structure. Again, a little bit of SQL manipulation in the queries that I'll show you can bring that about. And what you'll see is the number of pending tasks. The line, this is the length of the line. So you can see the busiest person, I don't know if busiest necessarily, but the person with the most work waiting is yours truly. with the most tasks online. So if we look at the SQL behind it, we're looking again at TBL action items, and particularly where the completion date is not filled in, meaning the activity isn't complete. And we're grouping by the employee ID. As before, there's another division over here. You can take only the pending tasks to get an idea of what's waiting right now for a particular person's queue. Or you can say that's not necessarily the case. What's waiting just means that you're working slowly. And we can have a look at not just what's waiting, but everything, all the number of tasks that have been processed by a particular person. And you can see who's working the hardest, who's pushing through the most amount of tasks. Now again, like before, you have to take this with a grain of salt, because one task isn't necessarily like the next. You can have a simple decision-making task, a yes and no answer, or a short form to explain something, and that would be the simple bit. And you can have a task, you can have a highly complex insurance form that can take hours to collect the information for, and to go around and to save and to check and to verify. And that brings us to the third sort of indicator, which is the average completion time. It does. We're looking at by particular tasks. In other words, we're assuming that everybody is working, everybody's a hard worker and everybody's giving it their best. And we want to look at the average, how long it really takes to finish up a particular task. Now this display over here is the average completion time in hours. Again, you can do it in any, if it's real again, it would be good. You can manipulate the SQL to show whatever you please. If you're talking about a higher resolution, you want to see more high grain, then you can manipulate it down to the minutes. We, of course, you're limiting it over here to the top performers, as it were, the ones that take the longest amount of time. And like before, you can create a timestamp so that over time you can see the trending also, how particular tasks might at first take a very long time, and after implementing training or implementing clarifications or documentation, you can see how that affects the amount of time it takes for each of your tasks to finish. Like before, if we look at the stored procedure the stored procedure involved, the task pressure is a tiny bit more involved than the others because of what it's taking. It's taking all the types, all the task type activities, and bringing together first the workflow name and then the activity name, so that what you get when you're looking at the presentation over here, especially the tooltip, is for each of these you don't necessarily have to look at the legend. You have the tooltip over there with the name of the workflow, the name of the task, and the completion time in the tooltip, and it allows you a clear idea of what's going on. Now, there's more than one way to skin a cat, as they say, as the Americans say, and there are plenty of indicators that you could potentially make use of. These three, I think, are good templates to start out with relatively little or none or no modifications at all. And as soon as you get your workflow, as soon as you get it kicking, as soon as you get it started, if you use these to take snapshots once a day or once every 12 hours, you'll pretty quickly be getting a trend of what's taking a long time, what's inefficient, what needs to be moved around. And sometimes it's not such a big deal. I mean, many times I hear reluctance to get into this because the response is, well, what if I find something wrong? I don't have the budget to revolutionize everything. And that's the cool bit, because my experience shows that many times with relatively minor changes, a minor redesign of a form, or a minor redirection of a workflow, dispense with an extra approver that gives whatever, that says yes 99% of the time anyways, can have enormous SLA improvements on how your workflows get routed and completed. These are the three examples that I have. If there are any questions about these or anything previous in the workflow, then I suppose now would be a good time. All right then. This workflow will be published, I think tomorrow. We'll have it out, the recording of the workflow, the presentation, and the scripts. And we thank you very much for participating. Thank you very much.